is pretty critical. All right. Well, hey, folks are jumping on, and it is past 6, so we're going to go ahead and get started with our Ask Us Anything. We've got a couple questions today, and we may take more if some appear on the chat, which is an open invite as folks join us. But the first one's a doozy, and it's a really, really good one and a really, really important one. So we'll see how well we can do with that. The question is, how do we learn and teach others how to have civil, helpful conversations about religion and politics instead of avoiding these essential, extremely important topics? Wow. Yeah, that's pretty relevant today, I think. Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate the question, and I appreciate the way that it's framed, because there's this progression here. How do we learn and teach others, and just kind of in the midst of that, remembering that it's important not to avoid this just because it's difficult. We don't talk this out ahead of time necessarily in terms of how we're going to frame this, but I have a suspicion that maybe some back and forth might be helpful. We'll see how Jazzy's doing. Yeah, thanks, Jazz. Yeah, there we go. See, we work together. We're the flock sticks together. So one of the first things that I noticed in the question I really want to affirm is that it starts out with, how do we learn to have civil, helpful conversations about religion and politics? And I really think that that's the key place to start, is because, well, number one, we're the only ones that we have any measure of control over. And so when we're engaging in this stuff, the very first piece that we need to understand is how we fit into it. It's not just that everybody else gets in the way of being able to have these great conversations. I would say it's important to begin that by acknowledging our own stuff, right? What I'm about to share, what I talk about, is also stuff that I'm still working on. It's a work in progress. Sometimes I do it better than others. I have hot button places in my psyche that if you push one of those buttons, you may bypass the part that tries to be patient and differentiated and all that good stuff. But ultimately, that's the thing. It's on me. It's not on the other person to be aware of that and to adjust for that and to be self-reflective enough to kind of know where I am at emotionally in the conversation, is not just intellectually what I believe, but how I'm responding and whether I'm listening, engaged, whether I'm open, whether I'm trying to be defensive, or, just all of that stuff's pretty important to know about ourselves, I think, going in before that. Now, having said that, sometimes there are people that just really enjoy pushing buttons. And that's where I'd say, if that's where they're at, you're not going to have a productive conversation anyway. And it's just important to know that you don't have to go there with folks who are behaving in toxic ways. If they're not interested in actually having a conversation, just let it be till there's a time when that might be more productive. So I'm going to pause there and say, I don't know if you want to jump in at that point, or.
Sure. I've been in conversations before where one in particular where eventually I said, do you want to dialogue, or do you enjoy arguing? And when asked quite bluntly, it's a bit awkward to ask somebody that, but when asked bluntly, the person said, actually, I really like a good argument as opposed to a dialogue. I just like fighting. So I said, I really don't. So I'm leaving this conversation. And there was someone that did not want to dialogue. They weren't really interested in convincing me. They weren't really interested in learning from me. They just really wanted to argue for the fun of it. And so the conversation was basically a waste of time. But, sometimes laying the ground rules for dialogue and saying, well, this doesn't feel like dialogue. Can we change how we're having this conversation? Can be important. I think it's also very important to surround ourselves with people who are not like ourselves.
Right.
That, if we're around people who are like ourselves all the time, we kind of become less we get stuck in that bubble. and we don't, the longer we're in that bubble, in a pandemic, obviously a bubble is a good thing. Physically, intellectually is not so much. The longer you're in that bubble, the more outrageous anything outside of that seems, rather than just a new and different perspective. It's kind of have less tolerance for that.
Well, I think that gets to something that's pretty important overall, that and one of the things I heard there was at the very start of it is what's the purpose, right? So sometimes we get into these discussions, we want to get into the discussions in order to convince the other person. That's not completely wrong. I mean, if we believe strongly that, we have something that's worth sharing, and we should, otherwise, why is it a deeply held belief? There is a hope that we might have that someone might come to see things the way that we do. But if that's the goal going into it, then it really does set it up as an argument where there need to be winners, where we have to be thinking about how am I going to score points, how am I going to maneuver the conversation, all of this stuff that isn't necessarily helpful. And if that's your thing, if that's what you want to do, if you just want to have a good argument, there are some folks that really just thrive on that. And if that's where you're at, God bless you. But because they're sometimes, if that's where both parties are coming from, maybe that's how they just dig deeper into truth.
There are people who enjoy boxing with each other and hitting each other, and it's good exercise for them if they enjoy that. That's fine. That's wonderful. I'm not one of those people.
But I'm assuming that it's really getting at what's a productive conversation, which pulls it back around to what's the purpose of the conversation about talking about religion and politics. And part of it is being able to clearly articulate our own self, but part of it is also if the goal is to pursue truth, if the goal is to find a better way together, if the goal is to understand one another better, all of those things are part of it. And I don't know that you always get there just by arguing, or even primarily, right? But one of the things, the other pieces that I really appreciate what you said, or that I heard anyway, is the importance of being around people that are different, that think differently. And because that sometimes that's more work. You have to work at understanding somebody whose perspective or experience might be different than our own. That's not always the easiest choice, but that helps in that whole process. One of the things I wanted to note about that self-awareness piece, though, starting with how do we learn how to have these discussions, I wanted to just highlight that sometimes these things are hard to talk about because religion and politics and some of these things go to the very center of who we are. Our image of ourselves, our values, and to have somebody disagree or reject something that's core to us can often feel like a rejection of us. But there's a space in between those two things that's important to recognize. Just because somebody sees something differently does not necessarily mean that they're rejecting us, although that experience can be challenging. We can feel that as a challenge. But I think that sometimes we might interpret that more personally than we really need to. And to recognize that when somebody is speaking with passion, or when they're speaking something out of their truth that we don't connect with, that may evoke emotion in us, but that's our reaction. That's not necessarily them deliberately trying to do that. I think it's important to kind of hear that, because if we can acknowledge that, we can sort of create space to hear someone with different ideas or understandings. All right. So I will do that here in a moment. Create space to listen to what they have to say and not necessarily need to receive that as an implicit criticism of ourselves. So, all right, I'm going to toss that back over to Gabriel to respond to moments.
Sure. And I think, again, the attitude with which you go into a conversation is also important. A couple of years ago, I was at a fiber arts festival and ended up having dinner in my hotel. which there were other people who were attending the festival there. And I had dinner with someone who's a Reformed Jew and a relative of hers who was a Jehovah's Witness. We talked for an hour and a half about lots of things, including the book of Genesis. Ended up sharing an appetizer together, and obviously had very different perspectives on something that all three of our faiths shared. But because we kind of were willing to talk about it, and we're interested in hearing each other's perspectives and sharing our own without trying to convince one another, it was a wonderful conversation. We had a lovely time together.
I think, we have those experiences. Maybe one of the interesting questions would be to look at what makes some of those conversations easy and what makes some of those more difficult. One of the thoughts that came to my mind, actually, Gabriel, was when we were back in Lebanon in 2011. So the first time meeting up with some of your friends and having this really fascinating discussion late at night in a restaurant, just kind of hanging out and catching up. You were seeing them for the first time in a long time, high school friends, and to me, we ended up having this really interesting conversation about the kingdom of God, where you had people from different facets of Islam, and us just talking about what that is. One of the things that struck me about that, though, was just curiosity, right? So nobody was trying to convert each other. We held truths that we feel are worth sharing, but this wasn't that moment. And I think the other piece of that comes into when we talk about religion, when we talk about politics. Is it really about us needing to convince someone else, or is it about having a kind of conversation that draws us deeper towards pursuing truth and to trust that, in our own theology, is God at work? If God's at work, can I trust that God will be at work in those conversations the way that God needs to? And so that the real task then is to just be attentive to to try to understand what the person's saying and to try to be clear about our own self. I don't have to, convince someone, but I can listen for what where they're coming from, what their experience is saying, what their values are. I mean, even things that we might really, really struggle with, and this comes out strongly in politics, right? And in religion, is there are deeply held values, and so often we seem to be talking past one another as if these are the only values that matter, and therefore we can't listen to or hear what might be driving some of this else. Now, yeah, there are more kingdom-oriented values than others. This is not, everything is all the same. This is not that. But there is that sense of we all have desires, we all have goals, we all have fears. And if we really want to understand and have a conversation, part of what we need to try to hear and listen for is, what's the other person really trying to get at? One of the opportunities I had a while ago was to participate in something called Resetting the American Table. That was facilitated by a couple of rabbis, actually, who had experience in trying to bring together Palestinians and Israelis just kind of to help them understand each other. And it was a fascinating training. And one of the things that they said that really kind of stuck with me, and I can't say that I'm perfect at it because my natural inclination is to find points of similarity and bridges. That's just how I'm wired. I look for that. And I think that's useful. But one of the things they said in having these kinds of difficult conversations is sometimes that attempt to find the bridges, find the common ground is useful, but we jump to that too soon. Instead, what they said, as hard as it is, their advice was to lean into the differences, to try to listen for and ask curious questions about, not gotcha questions, curious questions about, what somebody is saying that might highlight a difference, why somebody might think that way. Now, you wouldn't say, well, why do you think that? You could, depending on the level of trust, you might get a good response at trusting that it came from a good place. But, trying.
Tell me more about that is a good
Right,
neutral,
right,
non-confrontational way
right.
to.
I'd like to know more about that. That seems to be something different than what I would think. So, could you tell me more? And I think in that, one of the goals is, you've done pretty well if you can say back, and this sounds mechanical. So, part of the artistry of it is trying to find a way of, not just parroting back, but if you can restate what you believe someone to have said to you, if something that somebody said to you, if you can find a way to restate that in a way that they say, yeah, that's what I meant. There you go. Okay, now you have a chance to say, okay, here's how I process that. I think owning that is also a big part of that, not just universalizing, like, well, everybody thinks the way I do. Well, obviously not, or you wouldn't be having a conversation. Gabriel, when you were having these conversations, what were some of the dynamics that you felt made that possible?
Okay, so in the conversation about Genesis at the Fiber Arts convention, first of all, we were all there for something that we love doing, which is, for me, knitting. But we were also eating, and the hotel restaurant was just really small. It was just kind of a bar where you could order food, and we ended up sharing a plate of garlic fries. So already you have the commonality is just sort of the unspoken commonality was there, but then we were eating together. And so there was kind of a natural camaraderie around that. Yeah, and I think those were kind of two of the foundational elements that were, unspoken, but they were there. And other than that, it was, we did find things that we had in common. But there was a lot of curiosity about, I was interested in hearing, okay, what would be a Reformed Jewish interpretation of Genesis versus like a more conservative, traditional interpretation. And when I said I went to a Baptist church, that needed a bit of unpacking. Okay, what kind of Baptist and what does that mean? And
Yep.
so there was curiosity going into the conversation. And not curiosity in order to ask gotcha questions, but curiosity in order to learn more. So.
Part of the thing that makes this hard is that sometimes, and we just need to acknowledge it, sometimes it's harder to have those conversations about faith and politics, those deep core identity things, with people that we're the closest to, like with family and close friends, whereas, just because there's so much at stake, right? In this, or it feels that way, that if we go about this wrong, if we decide that we don't have as much in common with people that we love and respect as we thought we did, then what happens to the relationship? And, the side effect of avoiding that, though, is that the relationship will stay shallow. And, honestly, sometimes that's just what it's going to be, or you just can't go there because we can't control others. But in the comment, just it sounds like there was a lot of mutual respect. Yeah, and there was. And so part of that is just the respect of honoring the other person as a person. And that goes back to conversations about evangelism. It goes back to all kinds of important conversations that people are not projects. They don't have value just because of the end goal of, I want to convince you to my truth. It's, you have value because you're a human being created in the image of God, and you're my neighbor. And Jesus says, I am to love you. That's what we're here for. And Jasmine agrees. I'm going to interpret it that way about that. Yeah. So from that starting point, we just build towards respect, towards understanding, and we hope and we pray and we seek that together we might be guided towards the truth. part of the challenge, so that's a lot of that is all about that first part of that question. How do we learn to have those kinds of conversations? And then the other part's really kind of the kicker is how do we teach others to have civil, helpful conversations? And that's hard because it presumes that the other person wants that too. So if they do, then you're in business, right? If you want to gather around the table, if you say, you know what, we know there's got to be a better way, then that becomes the question that you can try to build on. If they don't, you can't force it, right? I mean, that's a matter for prayer. It's a matter for positive engagement, trying to build relational respect. Just again, it's all about relationship in the sense of, yes, you can have deep conversations with people you just met, but it still starts around the context of presuming and extending, okay, we're going to have a real conversation here, and I'm going to treat this person as a person. And, those sorts of things are foundational. And it continues around, staying engaged and where that goes. So how do you teach it? My own gut sense of this is I think that you teach it to the extent that you're both willing to go there by modeling the kind of engagement that you're aiming for, and by staying humble and centered. Humble doesn't mean weak. It doesn't mean that you don't know who you are. It doesn't mean that you're denying your own strengths. It means that, again, coming back to that phrase, creating space. If you're self-aware enough of, this is who I am, this is what I value, and no, I still have things to learn. That doesn't mean I don't know anything. If we're grounded enough in who we are, then we don't have to dominate that conversation. We can participate as a human being worthy of respect in the midst of that. And I think that people who are also seeking the same thing, that helps create permission. There is some vulnerability in that. Some people will take that and run with it. And then you got to decide, is this a healthy conversation to continue with? So, you just kind of go there. I don't know. I'm curious, Gabriel, maybe you want to run whichever way you want to with that, but I'm curious if there were cafe engagements, positive or negative, that fed into any of this.
Yeah, there were times that, you would have conversations with people and discover that you strongly disagreed on something. But usually by that point you had somewhat of a relationship, that there was already a friendship there. There were cups of coffee drunk together. There were, stupid jokes shared. There was enough of a relationship that by the time you discovered you disagreed about something really important, you liked and respected each other. And that was the basis for how you talked about whatever it was you disagreed about. Yeah. And sometimes, you would walk away from the conversation still passionately disagreeing. And sometimes you would walk away from it going, okay, this is not something that we want to really talk about anymore because it gets us both very upset. But, but you could still be friends and share coffee together. And sometimes there were times when you could go back to the conversation and say, okay, I thought about this more, or I did some research, and, you could kind of continue to circle around that and revisit it every time.
One of the things I hear in that too is about looking to create contexts where genuine relationship connection happens, right? Again, not just with the ulterior motive of here's this project, but, to seek out spending meaningful time with people, doing meaningful things. Not necessarily, some of it may be, meaningful in ultimate senses, I'm not sure I even want to say it that way, but, in the sense of when we work together on a project of shared concern. So like packing the lunches or short-term mission trips. If you're sweating together, you're not arguing politics. You might talk about it, but you don't have time to really argue, right? But, there's also things like knitting, like having a cup of coffee together, like sharing a meal, pursuing those kinds of just ways of doing life, spending time with people. I think that also echoes what Jesus did. We look at what he did in the Gospels. Well, he hung around. Yep, he taught. He healed. He also had dinner at people's places, right? So, he just hung out and ate with sinners and with the Pharisees, right? Who were also sinners, but, they distinguished themselves, like the respectable folks and those folks that weren't as respectable. Jesus would hang out. He'd spend time. They'd eat together. And in those contexts, trust was built, relationship was built, conversations happened, and the kingdom was proclaimed. So part of that is just trusting God to show up in those things. And I do appreciate the whole question, though, because there's part of our culture right now that would assume that everything's just going to be better if we just never talk about religion at all. Religion's fine if you want to just keep it private, keep it to yourself. It should never enter the public sphere. Your values should not influence any way that you interact as a public person. The only way for that to work is if your values don't have any impact on the rest of your life at all. It's unfortunate. That's a toxic way. And it comes about, frankly, because I think religion, and not just Christians, but we need to own our stuff in this, as it happens, is that when we move from participating to trying to dominate the discussion, then people are going to buck that. They're not going to respond well, and that's you won't get as far. Let's see. We got another comment. We do. We actually teach people not to talk about these things, that it's rude. I think it maybe a better phrase, maybe a better way to approach that would be, it's important to talk about those things, but to do so from a position of respect, and to also look for timing, right? What's the appropriate time? What's the appropriate context? When, and that can be challenging too, is to create those or to look for those opportunities to naturally engage. Sorry. Yep. Yeah. That happens. And all of that, though, you might notice, our story is talking about food, talking about working together, talking about sitting down and hanging out. Hard to do right now. Looking forward to that getting better. But we'll notice that Facebook, Twitter, memes, and images, those don't generally lend themselves to that kind of interaction. They're great for those punchy gotcha moments, right? The meme that if you just write it perfectly, you'll show the utter hypocrisy of those who are on the opposite side of whatever we're on the side of. Or sharing these memes of, well, if you're on my side, then you're going to like this. Share this if you love Jesus. We've been doing that kind of thing for a long time, right? What are the bumper stickers? All that kind of stuff. It's good to know that we're not alone in the world of those who might agree with us, but that's not really the same thing as building relationship and having discussion and creating the kind of space where that can happen well. So sometimes I've seen it happen. I've had moments on Facebook where we've actually had good conversations, or been able to try to find a way to gently push back on something that somebody said that really doesn't reflect their best self, and at least as I would maybe see that. Try not to do that publicly. That's, again, that's just treating people with respect. But for the most part, we need engagement. We need relationship, and to recognize lots of that can't happen when all you're doing is just throwing words at each other. It's so easy to mishear how, and the tone and the intent that's being taken. I'd say the thing that probably grieves me the most is when I see on Facebook, not that people post things where they disagree with me, or they say something that I would disagree with that has a value system different than mine, but how they go about it. When people do things in a mean spirit, I think that grieves me, because I know oftentimes these folks are better than that. And I say that knowing that I'm not perfect about that either. So again, I have to look in the mirror and make sure that I don't do that, or that people would call me on that if they see me doing that. I don't know. Anything else you want to add to that? I mean, this is a topic you totally explore for a long time, but great question. Encouraged to pursue that. I mean, keys are just relationship, listening to understand, not listening to win, not listening to just wait your turn to speak, all that kind of stuff.
And I think, for kids to grow up in a less divisive society, these are harder skills to learn as an adult than they are as a kid. And so, if kids are surrounded by people who are different than they are and have opportunities to see other perspectives, and hear other perspectives, and to see adults engaging with that in a healthy way, that will just be normal for them.
It's one of the things that points us to how much we need church. And it's one of the reasons that as much as we laugh about being Baptist, or at least, what kind of Baptist are you? For me, being an American Baptist, really is such an interesting thing, right? Because it covers such a wide spectrum of folks, different places theologically, sometimes often different places politically. And yet we try to be under the same tent, with varying degrees of success. But the reality is, I believe God intends the church to be a place where we model that, right? How do we model those disagreements? How do we, in our diversity, in our seeking after the truth and coming from different experiences, different perspectives, all of those pieces that make us us, at its best, that's what the church is meant to be. And when we do that well, when we're pursuing the truth, extending grace, calling out the best in each other, that's part of our witness. And it's part of what this world really needs. But it's got to begin, for us in the church, it's got to begin in the church. So that's our work to do. It's not the world's work.
You see glimpses of it once in a while. I just had a memory of when we were working with an organization called Stone Soup. There was a couple of people that were regular. The line between volunteer and guest was very fuzzy, very intentionally. And so a couple of people who were part of the Stone Soup community, who, and found they enjoyed talking with each other every week, and sat and had lunch together and talked with each other. And a few weeks into their lunch conversations, discovered that one of them was a former inmate of the correctional institution at which the other one had served as a guard before he retired. They were not there at the same time, but where else but the kingdom of God does a former inmate and a former prison guard, do they sit down every week and have lunch together? Just talk about life and the universe and everything.
Yeah, they're holy moments. Well, want to wrap it up. We've got one more question that I'm just going to try to touch on briefly. And it's a good one, but it's the kind that really needs kind of more of an in-person conversation on. But I do want to highlight it. It says, I'd like to hear more about the church's fellowship fund. How is it used? Does money flow through it fairly quickly to people in need, or does it often sit a long time waiting? That's a great question. I don't want to fully get into the details online, not because any of it's secret, but just because so much of it is situational. I want to be careful about expectations if somebody's watching this and thinking what we do or don't do all the time. The church has a fellowship fund. We actually have a number of different ways that the church gives offerings, both directly to local, national, international mission and ministries and other needs, but we also have kind of an emergency. That's what the fellowship fund is. If there are emergencies, either in folks in the church, members or friends, people who are part of the church family in one way or another, who have a specific need, we have the ability to respond to a certain degree to some of those needs, as well as needs in the community if people call us. Sometimes there are folks who just are in different situations. It covers such a variety of needs. how is it used? We've helped people out with gas. We've helped people out with groceries. We've helped people out with rent, sometimes with moving. In the past year, we helped someone out with a not insignificant, but not massive medical bill, but something that helped them kind of get back on their feet and kind of move forward in other areas of their lives, so they didn't have that bill kind of hold. But we're not always able to do that kind of stuff, but sometimes we can. It really just a variety of things, whatever the need is. Now, the other piece to that, though, is that we look at that as a emergency backstop to the pre-existing resources that are out there in the community. We're not out to try to duplicate. We're not here to try to do what other resources are. And so we try to, first of all, we try to hook people up with pre-existing resources and make sure that people are engaged with those options. Sometimes there are situations where people just don't like the other options, and sometimes that's hard. Sometimes we can work with that. Sometimes there are reasons for that we can kind of go with, and other times I have to say we reserve helping in that situation so we can help in other situations. Does money flow through fairly quickly? Again, it depends. One of the awesome things this past year, people were incredibly generous to this fund. So sometimes, it's just little bits here and there that it gets added to. This past year, folks were really generous, and that allowed us to help people in more significant ways. That does not always happen. So month by month, there might be quiet months. Then there might be multiple requests that kind of come in. One of the things that happened as the shelters experienced some challenges because of COVID and the very cold snap that we had just a bit ago. People were being housed in hotels. That's a very expensive proposition. Well, local agencies reached out to local churches, and we were able to partner with other churches and agencies in the area to make it possible for folks to have a warm place to stay. And we were able to do that to the extent that we could, and a not insignificant amount, because of folks' generosity. So sometimes it accumulates, but that also allows us to do bigger things when bigger things are required. Other times we're able to just kind of quickly move it through. We do not look at it as we're just trying to save it up and not use it. I mean, it's there to be used, but we want to try to use it wisely. And that differs month to month. So I don't know that's one that you can actually speak to too awful much, but
probably not, because I definitely misheard that. I know that some of that, it was through the fellowship fund that some funds were donated when we were doing the lunches for the people who were being housed in hotels because the shelters were full. Yep. And many of those things were just ingredients that people donated and brought. But there were things like takeout containers that need to be ordered online, or bigger purchases like big packages of chicken, where people donated to the fellowship fund specifically for that, and we were able to do those bigger purchases. So.
We really appreciate, and it's both a joy and a burden, because it's not always easy just trying to walk through with folks. Many things aren't simple, but life isn't simple. Our lives aren't simple. So we do that with grace and as much wisdom as we can. But those are our questions for tonight. We're going to do one more. So Palm Sunday, we're going to do the last live streamed. If you enjoyed this, please let us know. Drop us a line at the church. Let us know if there are other questions you'd like. Totally open to continue this. Again, I'd like to I said we just tackle one main question. It took us a long time, but we'd like to aim at some smaller chunks and maybe do this in a more interactive way. So open to feedback on that, what you found helpful, something if you'd like to see more of it. We may bring this back again soon. But thank you so much, everybody who contributed questions, folks who are just watching, checking in. Thanks much, and God bless you.